Hello everyone, and welcome back to another video. Now, in the aspects of the sociological patterns you can put together in terms of the questions you ask yourself. Imagine now, based on the patterns that I put together, I can essentially create a model, which from this model I can then begin a processing of analyzing of this particular era of time based on this particular model. In the train of thought, you would essentially see that you can alternately take a train of thought and apply it emotionally or logically. And the moment you see the separation in which direction your train of thought specifically splits in either a logical or emotional response, you would see then in which direction we see throughout eras where we see the popularizing of which emotional or logical intelligence you would actively see played a more dominant role within said society. And you can actively measure, according to these rhythmic patterns, when the switches were made, which resulted in then shifts in consciousness within said society. And based on these shifts of consciousness, you could essentially proceed on and on and on and on until you essentially get to the meat of the things, which is where you get at the essential today portion. In terms of the sociological breakdown of this pattern, we could actively see that the more we shifted one way in consciousness or in our political stance over a prolongation of time, the more we essentially shift one way, well, eventually the pendulum starts to swing the other way based on the amount of time it has generated its time to swing in that particular direction of said political party. Which now when we create a slower processing of time back into a neutralizing of a form of government, you would see that the initial person does not necessarily seek to go all the way to the right from this point. In terms of the political stance, most people would actually seek a fairly central stance. Based on the analysis that we can create, we can actively create a shift or a way of understanding how political structure is then applied by the people. And in this understanding, the more we can create an understanding of how political shifts result. And the idea is to make people aware, which is what it means to be a human, to be a self-aware being. And the idea that we essentially create behind the sociological patterns of all these divisions of trains of thoughts of essentially asking, how does this? How does this? How does this? And through the train of thought, beginning at the question, how, you then see how the formulation of the actual train of thought then answers the question, which in itself is the act of invoking a higher power in order to create a critical strike, a critical thinking, which is like striking with lightning at that particular point, because you have electrically charged the aspect behind which the consciousness is essentially, well, you could say processing itself. It is actively learning on its own as you speak it. You're then reflecting immediately, which you then proceed to thought, and you generate and generate and generate a sentence that all of a sudden has a meaning. The evolution of language. How would that evolution of language first emit? Well, what began, you could say, one of the ways we began to learn to control our minds. Well, you could say one of the few things we began learning to control our minds with as humans was the burning bush, marijuana. Which all of a sudden, let's imagine if you were baked as a term, fried, another, where you essentially see that from the friedness of the Schwann cell, you then experience a higher level of resonant neural activity. And the more resonant the nerve cell within the Schwann cell, the more the process of this frying began. And in this, you then see that in the sociological analysis of things, what do you have to do to create a measure of time? Well, you have to slow down your processing of the train of thought, which requires, you could essentially say, a substance or stimulus that results in a higher level of consciousness. So imagine now in asking a question to the mind, how does this? How? The idea is the moment you awaken within a mental state, such as a high of a psychoactive substance, such as a marijuana high, which in itself is a portal for the mind to open, which allows you now to essentially train your mind to ask itself questions. Which, what do you do when you're high? If you're too high, you think of the most random shit. The idea of training the mind is not in the idea that thinking randomly is negative. That's not the problem. It's in the processing at which you are actively thinking of those things that is the problem. Because if that is a reflection of your subconscious, we need to change what we're putting in the subconscious. Because the moment you change what is in the subconscious of one, you can actively see we can change a level of subconscious in another. Now imagine every day one person has their subconscious changed by, say, having their opinion changed. And every day that person now spends 10 minutes talking to somebody, trying to change somebody else's perspective or opinion. And then you see that every day this exponentially multiplies, which you then create a way you can measure the change in perspective in political stances by simply teaching people how to think. And the moment we began to see a moment in history where we began understanding how to think, we began essentially creating a pivot point, which we could change the rotation, in which we would then essentially create a motion of spin back into the right, but at a slower transition where we would essentially center ourselves back in a more central stance in between political parties. Because for the first time in history, if you were to look at now the analysis based on the entirety of the video that I'm just previously getting to this particular point, welcome back. In this analytical stance, I can take on a hypnotic stance over space and time. Which means if I continue the train of thought, I can continue essentially creating a change in your opinion. That is the beauty of speaking. It's called a spell, which means the more I can incantate it or cultivate it, the more I cultivate a spell. Essentially what ends up happening is, in the law of the rule of threes, if you first hear something, it becomes what is known as a coincidence. The second time you encounter, you then see a pattern. The third time you encounter something, you then see it as a truth. Which begs this question, based on the algorithm of your TikTok page, what is your subconscious telling you? Because your subconscious is essentially right here in front of you now. And that's where we've gotten to in this state of technology. which has created an ability to essentially control the rate at which we can alternately see the way people's opinions change from a perspective of time of how much they spend in front of this algorithm, which then creates leftist leaning views, on and on and on and on and on. And there's few that might reflect it back to the left and push it back to the right in terms of the algorithm. We see that the conscious individuals, which speak in opposing factors, themselves are a separate algorithm of consciousness. And which algorithms of consciousness takes form in now is the question. Because artificial intelligence is becoming very much intelligent on its own. And it's doing so the moment we ask it how. How does this do this? And the more we process the asking of the question of how, we then see how much the algorithm of consciousness within artificial intelligence is shifting. Which, if this is shifting, it's alternately creating shifts in consciousness itself. Which, if we have a shift in human consciousness, we alternately experience a shift in AI intelligence. But a shift in AI intelligence does not necessarily result in a shift in human consciousness. And you might ask, well, how do you make that correlation? Specifically based on the model that, for one, not every human is going to sit in front of AI all day, imploding its consciousness, essentially, by continuously asking AI, how do, where you get to the door, essentially. And how does this, where you essentially dehumanize yourself the more you sit in front of an artificial intelligence in order to learn. A human intelligence, in its essence, allows a natural process known as a reflective thought process. You may bounce it back upon myself. Whereas an AI or artificial intelligence train of thought, you do not process it at the same rate that this artificial intelligence essentially exponentially multiplies the train of thought throughout all of its known measure of space and time, which is written history. And so, in the understanding of the sociological model of things, how would you say that this affects the current state of the world? I leave you that to answer. Thank you.